In a 2-week crackdown, law enforcement in West Virginia arrested 38 individuals for failing to comply with sex offender registration laws. And this high-stakes operation targeted dangerous offenders, and I'm going to be speaking with renowned predator catcher Chris Hansen to break it all down. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. In a massive 2-week law enforcement initiative, authorities in West Virginia arrested 38 people as part of something known as Operation Cupid's Arrow. This was a high-stakes operation. It was aimed at non-compliant sex offenders and individuals with outstanding warrants for sex crimes. And this operation, you can kind of get the name here, it ran for 2 weeks from February 1st to the 14th, Valentine's Day. And it was led by the U.S. Marshals Southern District of West Virginia, but it was also the Cuffed Task Force, and it was in cooperation with the West Virginia State Police. There are a lot more entities that are part of this. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, the operation focused on Kanawha County and the surrounding areas. It targeted sex offenders who failed to comply with registration requirements. Non-compliance can mean several things, such as failing to register, not updating information, violating restrictions, like staying away from schools or playgrounds. Do have to note something here. Failing to comply as a sex offender in West Virginia, very, very serious felony offense. You could land in prison for up to 5 years on top of fines, a combination. But going back to this operation, according to an official press release from the U.S. Marshal's Office, the West Virginia State Police conducted 108 sex offender compliance checks and uncovered that 26 offenders were out of compliance. Of those, 15 individuals were arrested for failing to register, while the others had active warrants for sex crimes. A lot to get into here. Want to break it all down. I'm not going to do it by myself. Got a special guest back here on Sidebar. Renowned predator catcher Chris Hansen, host of Takedown on TruBlu and the podcast Predators I've Caught with Chris Hansen. Thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate
Jesse,
your time.
My pleasure. It's a big story.
It is. I mean, an operation like this, 38 individuals were arrested for failing to comply. Can you explain how important sex offender registration is?
It's critical because even in cases, Jesse, where, for instance, somebody gets probation and the victim is not happy about it, or if it's a sting operation and the authorities who arrested the guy don't think he should have gotten off with just probation, at least there is registration. So you know where that person is, and that's a victory. And this is something that the U.S. Marshals Service is very, very good at. And I'll give you an example. After Katrina, the hurricane that devastated New Orleans in 2005, there were like 1,400 registered sex offenders in the wind, because as you may remember, they opened up the jails and let everybody out because of the horrific conditions. The U.S. Marshal's Office went out and rearrested every single one of them, 1,400. Wow. All of them back in custody. So this is something they're very good at. But it's critical because if you don't enforce it, you've got people who don't take it seriously. They will not report. They will not register. And in this particular operation, there were some missing children recovered.
Yeah, I want to talk about that, but how often does it happen that people just fail to comply?
I think I can't give you a percentage, but I think they try to get away with it fairly frequently. And they don't often comply because in the past, you see a correlation between sometimes having somebody who's in this country illegally, for instance, so they don't want to have touches with the government, and they weren't as vigilant maybe 5 years ago on this issue, so they wouldn't have automatically requested an ICE detainer, so they're sort of in the wind anyway. And so we know through our research at TruBlu for Takedown that, for instance, in the San Diego area alone, there are 255 suspected or accused or convicted child predators who are in the wind, who are also illegal immigrants. They're in this country illegally. So the challenge is to get that data and then to form these law enforcement alliances and go grab these guys. They shouldn't be free. They shouldn't be on the streets.
Do you think the penalties are not strong enough to deter? I mean, I talked about here in West Virginia, it's up to 5 years in prison for reoffending. Do you think you need harsher penalties?
I think we need consistently applied penalties. I think the penalties are there, but I think in some cases, for instance, we did a sting this very same week in Alabama. 6 guys were arrested, ranging from a teacher to somebody who also was running some sort of credit card scam and had 2 guns on him, one in his waistband as I was interviewing him. So these guys are out there.
Wow.
Absolutely. And now this is a state where it's easy to carry a concealed pistol. I get that. So you see some of that, Texas, Georgia, other states. But it gives you pause, not so much that he was going to harm me or the law enforcement officers involved in the sheriff's deputies involved in the sting, but what happens if there is a girl there and he's alone with a girl or a boy and it doesn't go his way? He's armed. What if they want to cover up evidence? So it leads to this entire stream of very disturbing possibilities.
For people who don't know this, is there a lack of resources? In other words, if somebody fails to comply with their requirements, is it like the next day the law enforcement's on the heels? Or how in
some jurisdictions, typically they will do a computer search, and there are companies like LexisNexis which cooperate with law enforcement or are retained by law enforcement to help with these data searches. And they will say, okay, here's your list. These are the guys who are out there that need to be rearrested. And they will go out, as the U.S. Marshals did in West Virginia, and did a very good job of it. And that's one of the things they do best.
How important is the community in this, working with law enforcement if they detect or suspect someone might be violating?
It's hugely important. I mean, it's the old saying, and we tease about it in the news business, if you see something, say something, but it's really pretty true. And I think the environment now is better than ever for law enforcement to be receptive to a phone call or a tip saying, look, this guy is doing this, and we believe he's a registered sex offender. I mean, I look through these records all the time when I do a background check with Truthfinder, for instance. And you're familiar with their services. We use that for the podcast, Predators I've Caught. And one of the things it shows, not only the background of the guy we're researching, has he been in trouble since he first surfaced in our investigation, where is he today? And it also shows all the registered sex offenders who live near him.
I did want to get your perspective on this because you work on a lot of these kind of operations. To let everybody know, for this operation, you had several law enforcement agencies working in unison to carry out this operation. So you had the U.S. Marshals Cuffed Task Force, the FBI, the West Virginia State Police's Sex Offender Registry, the Internet Crimes Against Children Unit, the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the West Virginia Intelligence Exchange, as well as local agencies like the Sheriff's Office from different counties and numerous police departments across the region. How does that interagency, intra-agency cooperation work? I mean, talk to us about when you have so many different agencies together, how does that all work?
Well, it's critical, and we see it on our stings all the time. For instance, in Ohio, it will be HSI. ICE might be brought into it if we find illegal immigrants. You'll have sheriff's deputies and a sheriff in a county, for instance, Montgomery County or Livingston Parish, Louisiana, or Blount County, Alabama, Genesee County, Michigan. These sheriffs are very serious about this, but they also bring in people from other law enforcement agencies because the FBI can get a record check quicker in some instances than somebody else. Secret Service sometimes takes part in these because they find people who might come under their jurisdiction for other crimes. So it's important to have this multi-agency cooperation. And when it comes to something like child predators, every agency is willing to be a part of it. I mean, it's just so important. And what we've seen over the 20 years that I've been immersed in this is that the number of platforms where an adult can approach a child online for nefarious purposes has absolutely exploded. When I started, it was chat rooms and AOL, Yahoo, and that ancient thing that you may remember called MySpace. But now it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous.
You're not keeping up your MySpace account as most people are? Somebody might be looking at this and say, well, they committed some crimes in the past. They didn't register. What's the big deal? Besides that, putting that aside, in this operation, they recovered, as Chris said, 4 missing children, 4 firearms, 95.02 grams of methamphetamine, and 18 grams of fentanyl during this operation. So, Chris, first of all, how common is it in an operation like this? They're going in for one purpose, and they find so much more, including missing children?
Well, we saw it 2 weeks ago in Blount County, Alabama. Sheriff Mark Moon and his team, we had a guy walk in, and this guy online went on and on about how this is a risk-reward thing, and this is so wrong, and I shouldn't be doing this, and he shows up. The guy had a gun in his waistband, as I mentioned earlier, one in his car, and in the car were 30 credit cards not in his name. So what other scam was he running, right? So they always, not always, but many times, find out other crimes, and they find out that they've had other touches with law enforcement. We had a guy in Louisiana a couple weeks ago. This guy was busted as a young man, 18 years old, in a school videotaping a sex act with a 14-year-old girl.
Ugh.
It made the local news in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They went light on him because of his age, because he was actually a student, albeit 18. So fine, he gets diversion, he gets a second chance at life, as perhaps he should. But where is he all these years later? In our sting with the Livingston Parish Sheriff's Office. He's there to meet a child again. So what lesson did he learn?
It's so interesting you say that, because I want to touch upon some of the more specific people that were caught up in this operation. By the way, as you mentioned, with this other evidence that they found, you're also talking about enhanced charges, enhanced penalties that might keep them off the streets. But let's talk about this. So all these arrests are significant, but let me just pull out a few for you. So one of the more notable arrests was that of 34-year-old Christopher Sean Ryder from Lewisburg. And Ryder, who had allegedly been evading law enforcement since June of 2024, he was arrested on February 6th in San Antonio, Texas. He was wanted for failure to register as a sex offender and a parole violation. But here's the troubling part. Ryder had been involved in some very serious criminal activity years ago. Back in 2007, according to Fox 11 WCHS, Ryder, who was then 27 years old, was arrested on charges of failure to register as a sex offender and a parole violation related to the abduction of a 14-year-old girl. Now, as Chris mentioned, by the way, we were able to find out more information about Mr. Ryder on TruthFinder, the powerful background checker, including some of his prior addresses. His criminal history is also there, showing his charges of abduction of a person, kidnapping or concealing a child, failure to register as a sex offender. And by the way, Law&Crime, we partner with TruthFinder. We use it to get details on the people involved in our stories. But even if you don't work in true crime, it can be an excellent resource to give you some peace of mind. It's one of the largest public record search services in the United States. And with a paid subscription service, you can get access to unlimited reports about almost anyone. So right now, if you're interested, you get 50% off of your first month of confidential background reports. Just go to truthfinder.com/LC Sidebar. And then there was another key arrest involved in this. There was Charles Robert Kraft. He was also taken into custody of charges of aiding and abetting in the abduction of a child in connection with Ryder as well. According to the Greenbrier County Sheriff, numerous tips and leads from the public led to their arrests following the issue of an Amber Alert for 14-year-old Nicole Hall. Thankfully, Nicole was found safe, but as we know, situations like this, they don't always have a good ending. So talk to us about this. That's a big arrest right there.
Well, exactly. I mean, you're taking people off the street who not only have a propensity for exploiting children, but are involved in other crimes. And again, I go back to the situation in states where there are relatively lax carrying laws. So you can carry a weapon with you. Now, they may not threaten us with the weapon they're carrying, but what happens if there is a girl or boy there alone? And what happens if this scenario doesn't go their way? Do they use that gun? Do they try to cover up the evidence left behind, being the victim? So it causes a great deal of concern. And that's why suddenly carrying a legal weapon turns from, something you're allowed to do in a state to committing a crime, because the crime is committed while you have the handgun. Whether you own it legally or not, that's another charge.
You made a good point. Somebody should have another chance at their life. But look at the importance of the registration, because he broke the rule again, and look what he did in the past.
We had a case in 2015. We did a sting in Fairfield, Connecticut, and there was a guy who was 19 years old who, arguably had a rough go in life. It didn't justify what he was trying to do with a teenage girl, but maybe this guy should get a second chance, and he did, right? What happened? Just a matter of weeks ago, he violated his parole by getting a job working at a farm where children were. And now he's got to go to prison. Now, did he seek out that job to have access to children? I don't know.
Yeah.
I would like to think not. But unfortunately, when I think not, I'm more wrong than right.
Talking about more wrong than right, you want to hear about this guy? 50-year-old Christopher Rush from Elkview. He was arrested February 11th. This is a very disturbing crime involving a minor. So Rush allegedly used a child to create obscene material and send explicit images of himself abusing a toddler and sent it to another man over a social media and messaging app. Now, Rush facing very serious charges, including employment or use of a minor to produce obscene material or assist in performing sexually explicit conduct. And according to a criminal complaint just a day before his arrest, West Virginia State Police interrogated the man who had allegedly received those very disturbing images. And after searching his phone, authorities discovered multiple photos of a child, some clothed, others naked in a bathtub. That's the allegations at this point. And the man apparently told investigators that these images were sent to him through the Telegram app by Rush. There were also detailed conversations between the man and Rush, allegedly discussing sex acts to be performed on the child. It's really disgusting stuff. He's currently being held at the South Central Regional Jail on a $100,000 cash-only bond. I mean, does it get worse than that?
No, it doesn't, because not only was a child abused in the creation of this child sexually abusive material, CSAM as they call it, every time that image is viewed by another predator, that's the re-victimization of that child. And now they're selling this. They know that there's a sick, twisted, criminal population out there who will buy this. So they're making money. They've exploited the child. It is one of the worst criminal activities I can imagine.
And that is why this operation...
The penalties are so stiff here.
Yeah, and why this operation was so important.
Right.
Now, in addition to these very high-profile and disturbing cases, there were several other arrests that were made for various offenses, including possession with intent to deliver controlled substances, child concealment, malicious wounding, strangulation, federal probation violations. The additional 13 sex offenders, which ranged in ages from 32 to 58, they were arrested on a variety of charges, including failure to register, second-degree assault, resisting arrest. But also, the U.S. Marshal Service identified 5 non-compliant sex offenders who were in violation of something called the Adam Walsh Act. So I just want to break this down with you real quick, Chris. So the Adam Walsh Act was named after Adam Walsh. He was the 6-year-old boy who was abducted and murdered in 1981. That name sounds familiar. It should, because John Walsh, Adam's father, is a criminologist. He's the longtime host of the TV show America's Most Wanted. He's also currently the host of Investigation Discovery's In Pursuit with John Walsh, where he helps track down fugitives, find missing children. And in case you're not familiar with this story, it is so sad. Adam was abducted. He was taken from the toy section of a Sears store in Hollywood, Florida, after his mother just briefly left him alone to browse for a second. And what followed was a massive manhunt, but it ended with Adam's head being found in Vero Beach, about 130 miles away from where he was taken. His body was never found. The prime suspect, Otis Toole, a convicted serial killer, confessed to Adam's murder, and the case kind of went cold. Evidence was lost. Toole recanted his confession, but it wasn't until 2008 that the police officially closed the case, essentially naming Toole as the killer. By then, he had died in prison. He died in 1996, and despite a lack of new evidence, authorities were convinced that he was responsible for Adam's death. Now, before we even get into the act, you remember that case.
Absolutely.
That changed everything.
I was in Florida shortly after they found Adam's head in a canal in the intercoastal area. And John, I know extremely well. This horrifying incident motivated John and his wife to start the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is an incredible organization and a vast database and resource for parents to not only help them find their missing children, God forbid that happens, but also if you're looking for guidance because your child has mistakenly posted something, explicit online, they will walk you through step by step how to get that down. They also have incredible information on sextortion, which has been a very important subject to me. We've got a documentary that we're producing at TruBlu on it, and these kids get caught up in these schemes conceived half a world away, and they get tricked into sending, naughty pictures online, then are extorted, and some of these kids are committing suicide. NCMEC works across the board, and that's all because of John Walsh and his lovely wife who put this together years ago. They'll tell the story about all the letters they got in the aftermath of Adam's death, and they took all those, and she literally answered every single one of them. And they took all that energy and all that support and put it into forming NCMEC, which is incredible. And people who are watching this who have kids who have gotten dusted up or caught up in a bad situation online, NCMEC is the resource to help you get out of it.
Yeah, I appreciate you explaining that, because the work that Adam and his family have been doing is just amazing.
It's incredible.
And it led to what I wanted to talk about here, where I said there were certain people who violated this in this new sting, the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act. So this was passed in 2006, and it aimed to enhance the protection of children, create a more comprehensive system for tracking and monitoring convicted sex offenders. The key components of the law include mandating that individuals convicted of sex crimes register with state and national sex offender databases, specifying how long offenders must remain registered based on the severity of their crimes. It also created the National Sex Offender Public Website, allows the public to search for registered sex offenders in an area, and the act established mandatory penalties for offenders who fail to comply with registration requirements, including lengthy prison sentences. It also introduced a tier system for offenders based on the severity of their crimes. So, Chris, talk to me about the impact of this law and the tier system, too.
Well, it's been incredible. It's given law enforcement yet another tool, Jesse, to focus on this, and it's given prosecutors and the public another asset to keep track of these people who could potentially harm children. Now, yes, I receive correspondence from people, not frequently, but occasionally, who listen to the podcast saying, look, I have a propensity to act out in this way. I have an attraction to children, but I go to therapy, I go to all the treatment, and I've never offended. But far more people who have this going on in their mind and their soul do not seek the treatment, do not have it under control. And so the propensity for reoffending is great. And that's why these extra tools that can be given to the public, parents, and law enforcement are so critical.
Just to play devil's advocate here, is there any downside to making this information public about these people?
Not that I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, what's the error? Would you out somebody who committed a crime but hasn't offended since?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a cost of doing business here.
Yeah, and the fact that they violated it, there's people
well, yeah, once you violate it once. Now, again, look, I know there are cases where there's been a 17 or 18-year-old and a 15-year-old who are in a consensual relationship. That needs to be treated differently than, you know, a 38-year-old and a 14-year-old. I understand that. Also, people should not be put on a registered sex offender list for urinating in public or something like that. Right. That's happened, and that's obviously wrong. But the vast majority of the time, it works and works well.
Now, let me just tie this all up about the operation here. So U.S. Marshal Michael Bayless praised the success of Operation Cupid's Arrow. He highlighted that it had both prevented potential crimes, ensured the safety of communities, saying, "We have held sex offenders accountable, and we've taken dangerous fugitives off the streets. This operation made it clear that there is zero tolerance for individuals who refuse to follow the law, especially when it comes to sex offenders." And authorities continue to urge the public to remain vigilant. Those with information on non-compliant sex offenders or any other criminal activity, they are encouraged to anonymously report tips to the U.S. Marshals through the USMS Tips Hotline or call the West Virginia State Police. Chris Hansen, great seeing you.
Thanks
so much for taking the time.
Appreciate it, Jesse.
You got it.
Anytime.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.